Shalom everyone, and this is my second session of the series on the Holocaust. My name is Roger Lenk, and today in our four-part study of the Holocaust we're going to continue to explore in greater depth the interplay between the Holocaust, anti-Semitism and biblical prophecy. It's going to be something I hope that you'll find is very interesting. Please remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons and add your comments to the section provided below. So, by way of introduction now then, it's, I believe, very important for those who love Israel and the Jewish people to understand the Holocaust for a variety of reasons, not least because it represents a substance of anti-Semitism, which has filled the church under the banner of Christianity for nearly 2 millennia. And the uncomfortable truth is that the church's silence or active contribution allowed the slaughter of 6 million Jews. And for every Jewish survivor and their descendants to relive 6 million times the horror of the unthinkable. And in view of this, it's unsurprising that most Jews give no consideration for embracing biblical Christianity. And when a Jewish person, becomes a believer in Yeshua, he is generally branded as a persona non grata within the Jewish community and considered a pariah, ostracized for embracing a faith that represents to such people the very worst in persecution, spread over an expanse of 2 millennia and gathered under the banner of the cross. And this is indeed, I believe, a great problem. Many people claim that no true born-again believer would persecute Jews, but this sadly belies the facts. And others insist that instead of pointing fingers at the hypocrisy and the shortcomings of the church, the Jewish people should let bygones be bygones. Rather closely examine the biblical prophecies in the Tanakh without bias, but rather with open-minded integrity. And then, in their view, maybe they might discover the Jewish Jesus, the promised Messiah, instead of the Jesus represented by the Crusades, the pogroms, the expulsions, and the many other demonic anti-Semitic expressions focused against them. Although all of these things contain part truth, I believe it is still very much a lopsided argument. One that is prevalent within the evangelical churches, because words alone will do nothing to provoke the Jewish people to jealousy. It is something almost as inexcusable as those who choose blunt ignorance over facing the inconvenient truth about anti-Semitism, which the Holocaust did nothing but nurture. Today, anti-Semitism is alive and well and more rampant than ever. And therefore, I believe it's something which is all the more important for us to address. Hitler regularly quoted the Protestant reformer Martin Luther in his public speeches. And the vast majority of German Christians and conservative evangelicals followed the same path theologically and ideologically, fueling their hatred of the Jewish people. Luther's revelation of justification by faith became a doctrine overshadowed by this distorted justification, as it were, to slaughter Jews, and one that conspicuously ignores the fact such as that Yeshua himself, his disciples, the early church, and almost the entire body of Scripture upon which Christianity has been founded is entirely Jewish. When one considers the Holocaust, a question that always surfaces is, why does a loving God how could he allow the Holocaust? And yet maybe a better question is this: why did the entire body of denominational churches turn a blind eye to the Holocaust? The root is exposed within the ugly spectre of anti-Semitism that's promoted and expressed throughout the church age through erroneous and anti-Semitic teachings such as replacement theology that was introduced by the church fathers as early back as the 2nd century AD, and contained within this unbiblical and false teaching festers all the ingredients that nurtures hatred against the Jewish people. Replacement theology, also known as supersessionism, is a teaching that the Christian church has replaced the Jewish people regarding the plan, purpose, and promises of God, and that the homeland of Israel is now irrelevant. It has no bearing concerning God's eternal purposes. Supersessionists claim that God's promises to Israel must be spiritualized to be understood correctly. So when the Bible makes references to Israel's restoration, they interpret it as referring exclusively to the church, and all biblical covenants made with Israel then they believe were transferred to it at its inception. Replacement theology was introduced within the church by influential figures, including the church fathers, embedded in violent anti-Semitic statements that today would make our hair stand on end. And it didn't take long for it to become the official doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church, promoted by the Emperor Constantine and, of course, his successors. You will have seen, if you have a copy of my book, Bagels and Cream Cheese, in section 8a of the book, several examples of these types of statements made by the church fathers, supposedly godly representatives of the church, and whose influence has continued right down to the present time. People such as Justin Martyr, born around the turn of the 2nd century AD, claimed that God's covenant with Israel was no longer valid, and the Gentiles now replace the Jews. And Irenaeus, also early 2nd century AD church father, declared that the Jews were disinherited from the grace of God. And quickly, this hate speech and rhetoric increased exponentially. Tertullian accused the Jews of the death of Yeshua, and were therefore, in his statements, irrevocably rejected by God. A little later, still towards the later second part of the century AD, a church father named Origen preached that the Jews were responsible for killing Yeshua. Later on at the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD, a statement was made that, quote, "It is unbecoming beyond measure that on this holiest of festivals we should follow the custom of the Jews. Henceforth, let us have nothing in common with this odious people," end quote. By the 5th century, during the Middle Age period, the Christian leader John Chrysostom paved the way to legitimize the Crusades and other forms of active persecution against Jewish people. In one of his sermons, he preached that, quote, "The synagogue is not only a brothel and a theatre, it is also a den of robbers and lodging place for wild beasts. Jews are inveterate murderers possessed by the devil, and their debauchery and drunkenness give the manners of a pig. This is why, he said, I hate the Jews. Well, with these kind of comments, it's no easy thing to grapple with the spectre of anti-Semitism, and the more so if you happen to be Jewish. From the church fathers to the birth of the Roman Catholic Church, from the Reformation, introduced by Martin Luther, right down to the present day, the church worldwide has been saturated with anti-Semitism. And this raises questions that most believers would prefer to leave unchallenged. And yet the reality is alive and well, and it only takes a small spark to awaken the smouldering monster. Well, is it biblically possible for a true believer in Yeshua to be a convinced anti-Semite, even though the Bible clearly states that those who curse the Jewish people will themselves be cursed? Or tragically, a large cross-section of the church today and throughout history have been anti-Jewish and anti-Israel. When Christianity became the religion of the state in the 4th century, laws were passed against the Jews, reminiscent of those implemented by the Nazis following their rise to power in 1933. And very quickly, Nazi Germany rescinded all privileges that had been granted to the Jews that were systematically withdrawn over the following few years, leading to the Holocaust. Dr. David R. Reagan noted, and quote, the terrible truth, he said, that Christians do not like to face, and which many are aware of, that the Holocaust was the product of 1900 years of virulent Christian anti-Semitism. Close quote. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And alarmingly, we are seeing these very same things manifesting in even greater measure post-Holocaust, with a new wave of anti-Semitism spreading like wildfire throughout the world. Social media promotes fake news, propagating also a strongly anti-Semitic bias. For example, in blaming Israel for the displacement of the Palestinian people, who they claim are victims of Israeli aggression. Well, if we had time, it would have been profitable to debunk the argument supporting replacement theology, remembering that we're dealing with 2,000 years of theology immersed in anti-Semitic rhetoric. This important issue can be explored also in my book, Bagels and Cream Cheese, under 8b, chapter 8b of the book, should you be interested. But now let's move on to briefly consider the Holocaust through a biblical and prophetic lens. The prophets viewed the end times as a broad period that would begin with the restoration of Israel and end with the triumphant reign of Messiah in the millennium period. The initial phase commenced historically with the first wave of Aliya from Eastern Europe in the late 1800s that was encouraged by great leaders such as Theodore Herzl and Chaim Weismann, who interestingly were entirely secular Jews who founded Zionism for those who were non-religious, but identified passionately as Jews who were connected to the land of Israel. Next came the destruction of the Ottoman Empire in 1917, when Britain liberated Palestine from 4 centuries of Muslim rule. And this led to what's known or was called the Balfour Declaration in 1917. The next 30 years were characterized by broken agreements made by the British, where the original land promised to them was just carved up until basically only a very small fraction of what had been promised remained. And this culminated in the infamous white paper of 1939 around the outset of World War II, where the British Mandate limited Jewish emigration for Europe's Jews, fleeing from the Nazis, fleeing from the Holocaust, just to a mere trickle of a few thousand a year. Now, this was known as Aliya Aleph, which was legitimate, if you like, emigration which they considered to be legal. But there were around another 100,000 other Jewish refugees desperate to escape Nazi-occupied countries, and who in their desperation attempted to emigrate illegally under the defined terms of the British Mandate, and this they termed Aliya Bet. Many of those who made it to the shores of Palestine, miraculously, quite frankly, were intercepted by the British Mandate and subsequently exiled to British camps in places as Cyprus and Mauritius under harsh prison conditions. Well, despite everything, out of the Holocaust was birthed the State of Israel in 1948, and in 1967, the unification of Jerusalem following the Six-Day War. This is what Yeshua referred to when he prophesied how Jerusalem would be trodden down until the times of the Gentiles would be complete, which was a process that began with the destruction of the First Temple in 586 BC and ended its first phase in 1967. The phrase times of the Gentiles, found in Luke chapter 21 verse 14, is found only here in Scripture. The Greek word translated fulfilled in the phrase until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled is the Greek word pleeru, and relates to the fulfillment of prophecy that was a partial fulfillment. When Jerusalem was captured by Israel in the 1967, known as the Six-Day War, the 1967 war, many Bible students throughout the time thought that the times of the Gentiles were over. However, Israel's secular government returned control of the Temple Mount to the Muslims, which I guess helps us to understand when the times of the Gentiles will finally come to a permanent end. And we read in Revelations and chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, these words. And there was given me, it's Apostle John who's given the vision, the revelation, a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar, and then them that worship therein. But the court which is without the temple, leave out and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles. And the holy city shall be trod under foot 42 months, 3.5 years. Yeshua made it clear that Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And in Revelations chapter 11 and the first 2 verses, we are informed then that the Gentiles will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. This time period refers then to the 3.5 years known as the Great Tribulation, which precedes the Battle of Armageddon. And then in Revelations chapter 13 and verse 5, a couple of chapters later, we read that power was given to the beast, or otherwise that Antichrist, to continue for 42 months. And these are the same 42 months that will conclude the times of the Gentiles. There's a related phrase used by the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, chapter 11 and verse 25, where he refers to the fullness of the Gentiles, again mentioned in this one place only. So in what way do these two terms differ? Well, simply that the times of the Gentiles mark the time when Israel initially established political control over Jerusalem in 1967, after nearly 2,000 years. But the fullness of the Gentiles will only occur when the number of Jews and Gentile tribulation believers is complete. That's when Yeshua returns at the end of the Great Tribulation. And then we find in Jeremiah chapter 30 and verse 7, where it speaks of Israel experiencing a time of unprecedented suffering during the Great Tribulation. In other words, the final 3.5 years of that 7-year period, out of which God will ultimately deliver them. How dreadful that day will be. There has never been one like it, a time of Jacob's trouble, in other words, the descendants of Jacob, represented by the 12 tribes of Israel. Continue the quote. But out of it, he, or the Jewish people, will be saved. And we read in verse 8, which states this: on that day, in other words, at the climax of that period, I, the Lord, will break his yoke from off your neck. Speaking now this prophecy directed to the Jewish people. I will snap your chains, and foreigners will no longer enslave him. End of quote. So at the end of Jacob's trouble, when God will liberate Israel and destroy those responsible for their suffering, the fullness of the Gentiles will come to an end. And the influence of all the nations of the earth who have contributed directly or indirectly to the time of Jacob's trouble will also end. And so God has judged Israel for her spiritual infidelity. In other words, currently through permitting constant acts of terrorism and violence against it from her enemies, and yet combined it with miraculous sovereign acts of intervention. Every war of Israel since 1948 bears testimony to this. And this is because his covenants are not to be confused with his judgments. However, even this protection will be temporarily suspended in the tribulation period. And we're informed in Zechariah chapter 14 that 2/3 of Israel will perish at that time. Over the past 2 millennia, the Jewish people have experienced unrelenting suffering, characterized by expulsions and crusades and inquisitions and pogroms, and most recently, the Holocaust. All these things have been a precursor, if you like, to the future time of Jacob's trouble. Nothing, and not even the Holocaust, will be able to be compared to this. Although some people interpret Jacob's trouble as a one-time event restricted to the tribulation, we can also see how the seeds were sown earlier in the Holocaust, leading to the re-establishment of the Jewish homeland. God's set time to favour Zion was fulfilled, as prophesied in Psalm 102 and verse 13. You will arise and take pity on Zion, for the time has come to have mercy on her. The time determined has come. During the period when God pours out his judgments on the earth, he will woo, console, and restore, forgive, and ultimately vindicate Israel. It'll be the time when God turns Israel's heart back to him, having finally brought them to their knees with their pride broken, so that, as we read in Zechariah chapter 12 and verse 10, they will look upon him whom they have pierced, and they will return to him with great mourning and weeping. And this time will usher in a period of unprecedented blessing as they finally acknowledge and embrace their Messiah, Yeshua, who will rule and reign in the glorious 1,000-year period known as, of course, the millennium. Well, here's some more prophetic scriptures that I'd like to share with you, just regarding the future of Israel and God's judgment upon the nations. The first is from Isaiah chapter 51 and verses 22 to 23. Let me just quote it. This is what your Lord Adonai says, your God who defends his people. Here, I have removed from your hand the cup of drunkenness, the goblet of my fury. You will never drink it again, and I will put it in your hands of your tormentors, who said to you, bend down so we can trample you. And you flattened your back on the ground like a street for them to walk on. And also in Isaiah chapter 34 and verses 1 and 2 and also verse 8. Come, close your nations. Come close your nations and listen. Pay close attention, you peoples. Let the earth hear and everything in it, the world and with all it produces. For Adonai is angry at every nation, furious with all their armies. He has completely destroyed them, handed them over to slaughter. For Adonai has a day of vengeance, a year of requital for fighting with Zion. And Zechariah chapter 1 and verses 14 to 21. The angel speaking with me then said to me, here is what Adonai Sfaot says. I am extremely jealous on behalf of Jerusalem and Zion, and to the same degree I'm extremely angry with the nations that are so self-satisfied, because I was only a little angry at Jerusalem and Zion, but they made the suffering worse. Therefore Adonai says, I'll return to Jerusalem with merciful deeds. My house will be rebuilt there, says Adonai Sfaot. Yes, a measuring line will be stretched out over Jerusalem. In addition, proclaim that Adonai Sfaot says, my cities will again overflow with prosperity. Adonai will again comfort Zion, and he will again make Jerusalem, the city of his choice. And when we see more clearly the guilt of the church that has actively promoted anti-Semitism throughout almost its entire existence in horrific ways, that found full expression in the Holocaust, it behooves us to ask ourselves some difficult questions which we're really forced to grapple with. And here's a few, is a selection at any rate for starters. Number one, given the shabby history of the church regarding the Jewish people, what things can we do to readdress this issue? Then, what is spiritual Israel as defined by proponents of replacement theology? What are the implications of it theologically and practically? And then following the destruction of the Second Temple in AD 70, church leaders faced a big problem. What was it that it resolved to the detriment of the Jewish people? And what are some ways that Holocaust survivors and future generations can do to deal positively with this whole ugly spectre of anti-Semitism? And then how can Gentile Christians provoke the Jews' jealousy? A very, very important question. Well, digging a little under the surface will open up a massive container filled with uncomfortable realities that should challenge everyone who calls themselves a committed Christian to reevaluate the traditional church's narrative that has been smeared with anti-Semitic rhetoric for nearly 2,000 years. To pursue it is not actually to scapegoat the church, but rather to sensitize us to a right understanding that will draw us closer to the Jewish people and righten the wrongs perpetrated under the banner of Christ, who himself was a Jew, as were almost the entire authorship of the Old and the New Testaments, to which we, Jew and Gentile, has access, full access, by the grace of God. And so, coming to the end of this session, And until the next session, from me, Roger Link, Shalom and Lehitraot. I look forward so much for you to joining me next week.